Margaret Calloway pulled the letter from the dead woman's drawer with hands that would not stop shaking. It was not addressed to her. It was never supposed to reach her. The handwriting was careful, controlled, deliberate, as a rifle shot pressed flat against paper. They are going to take your land next. Get out before Aldridge finds out you know what those files contain. The previous clerk had been found dead in this office 3 weeks ago. Ruled a heart attack. Margaret looked at the letter, then at the 43 others folded beneath it. Then she locked the door. If this story pulled something in your chest just now, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Margaret and Elias's story travels across this country. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You don't want to miss what happens next. The land office of Redemption, Montana smelled like old paper, and something underneath the paper that Margaret could not name on her first morning, and understood completely by her third. It was the smell of things deliberately buried. Files stacked wrong. Drawers locked that had no reason to be locked. A ledger left open to a page that did not match the entry before it or the entry after, as if someone had replaced a single leaf of paper in the middle of a book and assumed no one would notice the binding crease. Margaret noticed. She had been noticing things like that since she was 12 years old, sitting on the floor of her father's Cincinnati office while he dictated deed language to his clerk, and she followed along in her own handwriting quietly because nobody thought to tell her to stop. She set her traveling bag down on the desk that belonged to her predecessor, a woman named Clara Hewitt, who had held the position of Haskell County Land Records clerk for 6 years without incident, and who had been found slumped in this same chair on a Tuesday morning in late September, with her coffee still warm and not a mark on her. The doctor had written cardiac arrest in his report. The county commissioner had written vacancy in his, and mailed the appointment letter to Margaret in Cincinnati 3 days later, because she was the only applicant with the necessary qualifications, and the additional qualification unstated but understood of having no family in the territory who might ask inconvenient questions. Margaret had accepted the position because she had $41 to her name and nowhere else to go, and because her father had always said that the only thing more dangerous than a woman with nothing left to lose was a woman with nothing left to lose who knew how to read a contract. She started with the surface files. Routine transfers, timber leases, homestead claims filed and approved in the standard sequence. Everything looked correct. Everything looked, in fact, a little too correct, the kind of correct that came from someone going back through records after the fact and making sure the surface held. It was the bottom drawer that stopped her. It was locked, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that the key was not on the ring she had been handed by Commissioner Aldridge that morning when he walked her through the office with the particular brand of courtesy that men used when they were deciding how much of a problem you were going to be. Straightforward work, he had told her, standing too close to the desk in his good wool coat. Clara kept excellent records. You'll find everything in order. I'm sure I will, Margaret had said. She had not told him that she had already noticed the ledger. She had not told him about the binding crease. She was her father's daughter, and her father's first rule had been simple: when someone tells you everything is in order, that is the precise moment to start looking for what isn't. She found a hairpin in the desk's center drawer. It took her 4 minutes to open the locked one. She had picked worse locks with worse tools in worse circumstances, and she did not feel guilty about any of it because the records in that drawer were public property, and she was the public official responsible for them. And if that argument needed to be made to someone later, she was fully prepared to make it. The letters were at the bottom beneath a folder of routine timber assessments, 43 of them, all in the same handwriting, all addressed to Clara Hewitt, all unsigned except for a single initial at the bottom of each page. E. Margaret sat down in Clara's chair in the office that was now hers and read every one. It took her 2 hours. When she was finished, she sat very still for a long moment, with her hands flat on the desk, the way her father had taught her to do when she needed to think without her hands getting ahead of her brain. Then she stood up, relocked the drawer, put the hairpin back where she found it, and walked out of the land office into the main street of Redemption, Montana, with her face arranged into the expression of a woman who had just had a perfectly ordinary first morning at her new position. The first letter had been written in July, 3 months ago. It was brief and practical, the language stripped of anything personal, like a man who was very careful about what he committed to paper. Clara. The garrison deed does not match the survey filed in 1871. Somebody changed the boundary markers in the written description. The original plat is still in the county surveyor's archive in Helena if you need it. Do not mention this to Commissioner Aldridge. Do not mention this to anyone at the bank. E. The second letter was 2 weeks later. Clara. I checked the Finch parcel. Same problem. The northwest boundary has been rewritten. The original deed gives Dorothy Finch 60 acres, including the creek access. The current record gives her 42 and cuts the creek out entirely. She doesn't know yet. She will when they come to collect. E. By the 10th letter, the picture was clear enough that Margaret's hands had started their shaking and did not stop. Aldridge had been doing it for at least 2 years. He controlled the notary who certified transfers, and he controlled the clerk who filed them. And between those 2 points of control, he had created a system for quietly rewriting the boundaries of homestead parcels after they were filed, shrinking them, removing water, access, erasing improvements that would have affected valuation. All of it done in ink that matched the original closely enough to fool anyone who was not looking for the crease in the binding. When the homesteaders could not prove their claims matched the official record, Aldridge's bank called their notes. When the notes were called and the land went to auction, a Chicago land company bought it at cents on the dollar. Margaret had seen enough of her father's case files to know exactly what kind of men sat behind that Chicago company and exactly what they were building toward. The last letter had been written 6 days before Clara Hewitt died. Clara. I am sorry. I know I have asked too much of you. I know you are frightened. You should be. I am going to find another way to get this to someone who can act on it. In the meantime, get the original garrison survey from Helena yourself if you can, and keep it somewhere he cannot touch. If something happens before I find that person, the letters are in the bottom drawer. Someone will find them eventually. Someone always does. E. Margaret stood on the boardwalk outside the land office and looked at the Street of Redemption in the flat October light, and thought about Clara Hewitt's warm coffee, and the doctor's report, and the word cardiac, and what it cost a man to arrange for a word like that to appear in an official document. She thought about the 43 letters, and the man who wrote them, and the initial at the bottom of each one, and the particular loneliness of writing that many words to someone who would never answer. Then she thought about Dorothy Finch. She found the seamstress shop 2 blocks down a narrow storefront with a hand-lettered sign and bolts of fabric visible through the window. The bell above the door announced her. A woman in her early 60s looked up from the cutting table, and Margaret saw in her face the particular quality of someone who had been managing fear for long enough that it had become a kind of posture. Mrs. Finch, Margaret said. My name is Margaret Calloway. I'm the new land records clerk. Dorothy Finch set down her scissors with deliberate care. I know who you are. Commissioner Aldridge mentioned you'd be coming. I imagine he did. Margaret moved to the counter and kept her voice low. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, and I need you to understand that what you tell me does not leave this room. Something shifted in Dorothy Finch's eyes. Not quite hope. More like the memory of what hope had felt like before something happened to it. Ask, she said. Did you know that your land grant has been altered in the county records? The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. I suspected, Dorothy said finally. When the bankman came last spring and started talking about my water rights, I went to look at my deed copy and something felt wrong. The language wasn't right. But my copy and the county copy matched, and when 2 documents say the same thing. It means someone changed both, Margaret said. Not one, both. Dorothy sat down on the stool behind her counter. She did it the way people sat down when their legs stopped cooperating. Clara knew, she said. It was not a question. Clara knew. And now Clara is dead. Dorothy's voice was flat and certain as a deed statement. And you are sitting in her chair, Miss Calloway. And you are a woman alone in a town where Commissioner Aldridge has his name on every important piece of paper. And I have to ask you directly, how long do you think it will take him to figure out that you found whatever she left behind? Less time than I would like, Margaret said. Which is why I need to know one thing. The man who was helping Clara. The one who was feeding her information about the altered records. Do you know who E is? Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the street before she spoke. Elias Graves, she said. Former U.S. Marshal. He has a small cattle operation about 6 miles northeast. He comes into town most mornings early before anyone is properly awake. Leaves whatever he's leaving and rides back out. Leaves it where? Clara's office, under the door. Dorothy turned from the window. He stopped about 2 weeks before she died. I thought I assumed he knew. That something had frightened him off. She paused. He was at her funeral, stood in the back, left before anyone could speak to him. What do you know about him? Margaret asked. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. I know he was the best marshal this county had for 8 years, she said. And I know that 4 years ago he testified wrong in a land fraud case, not this one, a different one, and an innocent man went to prison and died there. I know Elias Graves resigned the day he found out. I know he bought that cattle parcel and has barely spoken to anyone since. She met Margaret's eyes. I know he is the only person in this county who understood what Aldridge was doing before anyone else did, and I know that he tried to stop it alone and in secret, and through a woman who is now dead, which tells me something about what he thinks his word is worth in a courtroom. Margaret looked at the street through the window. He comes in early, she said. Before anyone is awake. Most mornings, yes. Then I'll be awake. She left the seamstress shop and walked back to the land office and spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what Commissioner Aldridge expected her to do, which was file organized catalog and appear competent and unremarkable. At 4 o'clock, Aldridge himself appeared in the doorway with his wool coat and his careful smile. Settling in all right, Miss Calloway? Very well, Commissioner. Your predecessor kept excellent records. She did not look up from the ledger she was transcribing. I expect I'll have a full accounting of the current active files by end of week. No rush, he said pleasantly. Take your time. She heard what he meant underneath the words. She had always been good at hearing the gap between what men said and what they meant. Her father had called it a gift. She had always suspected it was just survival. I appreciate that, she said. I do like to be thorough. When he left, she listened to his footsteps on the boardwalk and counted to 100 before she allowed herself to sit back in Clara Hewitt's chair and breathe. She was thorough. She was also terrified, and she had found over the years that being both at the same time was not only possible, but frequently necessary. She slept poorly. The apartment above the land office was small and cold, and she lay in it, listening to redemption settle into quiet around her, and thinking about 43 letters, and a woman found dead in her chair, and a man who rode into town before anyone was awake to leave warnings to someone who could no longer read them. She was at the window before dawn. She saw him at first light. He came in from the northeast, as Dorothy had said, moving at a pace that was not hurrying and not dawdling a man on a horse who knew exactly where he was going and had made peace with going there alone. He was tall in the saddle, lean, wearing a brown coat and a hat pulled low, and he rode the way men rode when they had stopped thinking about how they looked and were only thinking about where they needed to be. He stopped in front of the land office. He reached into his coat. He looked at the door for a long moment, just looked at it. And something in the angle of his shoulders, the particular stillness of him, made Margaret press her hand flat against the cold glass of the window above and hold her breath. Then he put whatever he had taken from his coat back inside it. He had not known, she realized. He had ridden in this morning, the way he had ridden in dozens of mornings before, with something written in that careful hand, something meant for a woman who no longer sat at the desk inside, and something had stopped him at the last moment. Some instinct, or some grief, or some version of both that she could not name from a second-floor window. He sat there for another full minute. Then he turned his horse and started back the way he had come. Margaret was down the stairs and out the front door before she had made a conscious decision to move. "Wait!" she called. He stopped. The horse stopped. Neither of them turned immediately, and Margaret had the distinct impression of a man doing rapid internal calculations. Then he turned in the saddle and looked at her. His eyes, even in the early light, were very dark, and they moved over her with the quick assessing quality of someone trained to take inventory of a situation fast. She saw him register that she was not Clara. She saw him register what that meant. She saw something that was not quite grief and not quite relief cross his face before he put it away. Somewhere she couldn't see it. "You're not Clara Hewitt," he said. His voice was low, rougher than she expected, like something kept deliberately quiet for so long it had forgotten its own volume. "No," Margaret said. "Margaret. I'm Margaret Calloway. I'm the new clerk." She paused. "I found the letters, Mr. Graves." He went very still. "All 43 of them," she said. "And I read every word." Silence. The horse shifted its weight. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. "I don't know what letters you're referring to," Elias Graves said. "Yes, you do." Margaret crossed her arms against the cold and held his gaze across the distance between them. "You know exactly what letters I'm referring to, because you're holding the 44th in your coat pocket right now, and you stopped yourself from leaving it because something told you the person who was supposed to receive it was gone. You were right about that. She's been gone 3 weeks. Another long silence. How did she die? The question came out quiet and stripped of pretense, and Margaret understood that he had been carrying it since the funeral and had no one to put it down with. "The county says cardiac arrest," she said. "And what do you say?" "I say the coffee was still warm," Margaret said. "I say the bottom drawer was locked and the key was missing. And I say that a woman who had been carefully documenting evidence of a major land fraud scheme for 3 months does not simply stop her heart at 41 years old without someone's assistance." Elias Graves looked at her for a long time. Then he swung down from his horse in one practiced motion, tied the reins to the hitching post, and walked toward her with the deliberate step of a man who had made a decision and intended to live with it. "We should not be having this conversation in the street," he said when he reached her. "No," Margaret agreed. "We should not. If Aldridge sees—" "Aldridge was in his office when I left yesterday, and he will not be out before 7, and it is currently 20 past 6, she said. "I have time. What I don't have is the original garrison survey from the Helena archive. The notary records from the period when the alterations were made, or a single witness, besides yourself, who is willing to put their name on paper." She met his eyes directly. "I have 43 letters written by a man who understood exactly what was happening in this county, and chose to communicate it through an intermediary instead of walking into the territorial attorney's office himself. I'd like to know why." Something moved across his face. Old pain, she thought. The specific variety that came not from what had been done to you, but from what you had done yourself. "Because my word is not worth the paper it would be written on," he said quietly, "in any courtroom in this territory. Is that what you believe, or is that what you've decided to keep believing, because it means you don't have to try again?" The words landed harder than she intended. She watched them land. She did not apologize for them. Elias Graves looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, and then said very quietly, "You are either the most useful person I have met in 4 years, or the most dangerous." "I am both," Margaret said. "And I need your help, and you need mine, whether you are ready to admit it yet or not. So." She turned toward the office door. Come inside before someone sees us, Mr. Graves, and tell me everything you know that isn't in those letters." He looked at her for another moment. Then he followed her inside. The door closed behind them, and Redemption, Montana went on waking up around the land office without knowing that inside it, a woman who had come to this territory with $41 and nothing left to lose was sitting down across a battered desk from a man who had spent 4 years convinced that justice was something that happened to other people, and they were about to decide together whether either of them was brave enough to try and change that. Elias Graves reached into his coat and set the 44th letter on the desk between them. "I wrote this one this morning," he said. "Before I wrote in, old habit." His jaw tightened. "I didn't know she was gone." Margaret looked at the letter. She did not pick it up. "You've been riding into town every day," she said, "leaving warnings, for 3 months. "Longer than that," he said. "The first ones I slipped under the door of her house. When she moved the operation to the office, I started leaving them there." He paused. "She was careful, she was thorough. She understood the records better than I did, and she had access I didn't have. And when she stopped responding," his voice dropped to something barely above the sound of the fire in the small stove, "I thought she was frightened. I thought she needed more time. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "She kept every letter," she said. "Every single one. Organized by date, hidden where only someone who knew how to look would find them. She trusted that someone would find them eventually." She looked at him directly. "She trusted you." "She shouldn't have." "She was right to," Margaret said. "Because here you are." Elias Graves looked at the desk, at the letter he had written that morning to a dead woman, at his own handwriting pressed flat against the paper, deliberate as a rifle shot. "What do you need from me?" he said. Margaret reached into her apron pocket and placed a sheet of paper on the desk beside his letter. On it, she had written in the small hours of the morning a list of exactly 12 things she needed to build a legal case that could not be dismissed, buried, or quietly ruled a cardiac arrest. "Start at the top," she said. "Tell me which ones are possible." Elias Graves picked up the list. He read it slowly, the way men read things when they are measuring the distance between what exists and what would have to be true for it to work. Then he set it down, and for the first time since he had walked through her door, something in his face shifted into something that was not grief and not calculation. Something older and more fragile than either. "All of them," he said. "If we're careful, if we're very careful and very fast, and if Aldridge does not realize what you are before we are ready." He met her eyes. "And if you understand that the moment he does realize it, this becomes significantly more dangerous than a records dispute." "I understand that," Margaret said. Clara understood it too. The sentence fell between them like a stone into still water, and they both sat with the ripples for a moment. "I know," Margaret said. Her voice did not shake. She had decided sometime in the small hours of the night that her voice was not going to shake. "And I am asking you anyway, because those 43 letters are 43 chances that someone did not take, and I intend to take this one." Elias Graves was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You should know something about me before you decide to trust me." "I already know about the Harmon case," she said quietly, "and the man who died in prison." Whatever he had prepared to say stopped in his throat. "Dorothy Finch told me," Margaret said. "She told me everything she knew." "Then you know why my testimony won't?" "I know why you think it won't," she said. "I also know that the territorial judge for this circuit rotated last spring, and the new appointment came out of Billings, not Helena, which means he does not have any prior relationship with Aldridge's political connections." She held Elias Graves' gaze and did not look away. "A man's past testimony does not bar him from future testimony, Mr. Graves. Only his current credibility matters, and his current credibility depends on the quality of the evidence he brings with him." Elias stared at her. "You looked up the judicial appointment," he said. "Last night. The Helena papers had the announcement in August. You only arrived yesterday." "I do a great deal of reading on trains," Margaret said. A long silence. And then for the first time, Elias Graves did something she had not expected. He almost smiled. It was barely there, the ghost of a thing there, and gone like a match lit in wind. But she saw it, and she filed it away in the same part of her mind where she filed the binding creases and the locked drawers and the 43 letters from a man who had been riding into this town alone every morning for months, leaving words for someone who could no longer answer. "All right, Miss Calloway," he said. "Show me the garrison file." She did. The garrison file was worse than the letters had suggested. Margaret spread the documents across the desk in the order she had found them, and Elias stood on the other side and looked at them the way a man looked at something he had known was bad and still found worse than expected. His jaw tightened. He did not touch anything. He had the instincts of someone trained to treat evidence like it could be taken from him, which Margaret was beginning to understand it had been before. "The survey line," he said. "Right there, you see it." "The creek boundary," Margaret said. "In the original plat, it runs northwest to southeast, giving the garrison parcel full riparian rights on the eastern edge. In the current county record, it runs due east. 11 degrees of difference. Enough to push the water access entirely onto Aldridge's adjacent parcel. Thomas Garrison has been paying for water he legally owns for 2 years, Elias said. Paying Aldridge's land company for access to his own creek. And he has no idea the deed was changed because his personal copy was changed too. Margaret set down the file. Someone went to Thomas Garrison's home and swapped the document. Or had someone do it for them. Elias looked up. Aldridge doesn't do the physical work himself. He has a man, name of Cutter, runs the land company's local office, manages the notary operations, handles the paperwork side of the alterations. He paused. And handles the other side when paperwork isn't enough. The other side. Margaret did not ask him to elaborate. She understood what he meant, and she understood that he had chosen those words carefully, and she stored the name Cutter in the same place she had stored everything else. How many parcels? She asked. That I can document 14. That I believe have been altered based on circumstantial evidence 22. He said it flatly the way you said numbers when the numbers were so large that emotion attached to them became a weight you couldn't carry and still function. Aldridge has been systematic. He targets parcels with water access or timber rights, or both because those are the ones the Chicago company wants for the railroad route. The homesteaders on those parcels are mostly people who came out here with nothing built. Something from nothing, and have no legal resources to fight a county commissioner with a cooperative notary and a bank that holds their notes. Until someone with access to the records noticed, Margaret said. Clara noticed. His voice went careful around her name. She was thorough, careful. She started pulling original survey maps from the Helena archive and comparing them to the county records, and she found the discrepancies the same way you did, methodically, one file at a time. And she came to you, or you came to her. I came to her. Something in his expression shifted, and Margaret recognized the particular quality of guilt that had been lived with long enough to become architecture. I'd been watching Aldridge for over a year before Clara. Watching and not acting because... He stopped. Because of the Harmon case, Margaret said. He looked at the window. At nothing, really. At whatever was behind the window that only he could see. I testified wrong in that case, he said. Not wrong as in false. Wrong as in insufficient. I had evidence that the defendant was innocent, and I presented it in a way that allowed it to be discredited because the circuit judge at the time was politically connected to the prosecution, and I was naive enough to think the truth would hold its own weight without me fighting for it. His voice was controlled and even, and completely stripped of self-pity, which made it worse than if it had not been. The man's name was Robert Aldean, He was 44 years old, a homesteader out of Bozeman with a wife and 3 children. He died in the territorial prison 11 months into a 5-year sentence. Pneumonia, they said. Margaret said nothing. She had learned from her father that some silences needed to be filled by the person speaking them, not by the person listening. I resigned the day I received the notification, Elias continued. And I have spent 4 years trying to decide whether that resignation was an act of integrity or an act of cowardice dressed up as integrity. He finally looked at her directly. I still don't know the answer to that. I think, Margaret said slowly, that the question you should be asking is not why you resigned. The question is what you do now. His eyes met hers with an expression that was difficult to hold, not because it was hard or closed, but because it was the opposite of that. It was open in the way things were open after they had been broken and hadn't finished deciding what shape they were going to take when they healed. I've been trying to do something, he said. That's what the letters were. The letters were the right answer to the wrong question, Margaret said. You were trying to act without being seen acting, which makes sense given your history. But Clara is dead, which means invisible action has a cost you did not anticipate. She kept her voice steady and not unkind. The only way to stop Aldridge is to be visible, Mr. Graves. Publicly, legally on the record. That is the only mechanism that cannot be buried quietly. And if my testimony is dismissed, if Aldridge's connections in Helena are strong enough to have the case reassigned to a cooperative judge, if Cutter decides that the new clerk is a problem that needs to be solved the same way the last one was, then we will have failed with our names attached to the attempt, Margaret said, which is better than succeeding quietly through letters that can be destroyed and a dead woman that can be ruled a cardiac arrest. She looked at him steadily. I am not asking you to be unafraid, Mr. Graves. I am asking you to be afraid, and do this anyway. The morning light had moved across the floor while they talked. Full day now. Margaret could hear redemption assembling itself outside, the sounds of a town coming to life, boots on boardwalk, a horse being worked in the street, the distant bell of the general store opening. We have a limited window, she said. Aldridge handed me this position because he believed he could manage me. He believes that because he has always been able to manage the people put in positions of access to those records. He managed Clara for 3 months before he ran out of patience. She gathered the garrison file and returned it precisely to its place. He will begin testing me within the week. Small tests first. He'll ask me to verify something that requires me to confirm a falsified record. If I confirm it, he knows I'm compliant. If I don't, he knows I'm not. How long before he moves past tests? That depends on how quickly he perceives a threat. Margaret moved to the cabinet where the surveyor correspondence was filed and opened it with the key that was not the hairpin this time. Which means we need the Helena archive materials before he realizes we're looking for them. And we need at least 2 homesteaders willing to testify to what their original deeds said, with enough corroborating documentation that their testimony cannot be dismissed as memory or confusion. Thomas Garrison will testify, Elias said. He's been angry for 2 years. He just hasn't had anyone explain to him what he's been angry about in legal terms he could act on. And Dorothy Finch. He was quiet for a moment. Dorothy lost more than the creek access. She lost the timber rights on the northeast quadrant of her parcel. Aldridge's company has been harvesting that timber for 18 months. He paused. She knows. She's known for a long time. She hasn't said anything because she has no one to say it to who can do anything about it. She has me now, Margaret said. And she has you. She had Clara too, Elias said quietly. The words were not intended as an accusation. Margaret understood that. But they landed the way they landed, and she let them, because she thought he needed to say it, and she thought she needed to hear it, needed to understand the full weight of what she was sitting in the middle of, without flinching away from any of it. Yes, she said, she did. And Clara found the letters and kept the records and protected the evidence until someone could come who was in a position to use it. That is not nothing. That is everything, in fact. That is the reason we are standing here with something to work with instead of nothing." She closed the cabinet. "Clara Hewitt did her part. Now we do ours." Elias looked at her for a long moment with that open, unfinished expression. "You are very certain for someone who has been in this town for less than 48 hours, he said. "I am terrified for someone who has been in this town for less than 48 hours, Margaret said. "I am choosing to act like certainty, because the alternative is paralysis and I don't have time for it." She met his gaze. "Are you going to help me or not, Mr. Graves?" The question sat between them plain and without ornamentation, and Elias Graves looked at it the way he had looked at the garrison file, like a man measuring the distance between what he knew was bad and what he was beginning to understand was necessary. "I'll ride to Helena tomorrow," he said. "I know the archivist in the surveyor's office. We've corresponded. If I go in person, I can pull the original plat records for every parcel on your list without triggering a formal records request that goes through official channels." "Aldridge has contacts in Helena," Margaret said. "Not in the surveyor's office. That's a separate administrative structure from the land commissioner's office. Different building, different staff, different political connections." For the first time there was something in his voice that might have been confidence, quiet and rusty and careful, like a door being opened that hadn't been used in a while. "I know how these systems work. I know where the walls are between them. That's not nothing either." "No," Margaret said. "It isn't." He picked up his coat from the chair where he had set it. He picked up the 44th letter from the desk. He looked at it for a moment, at his own handwriting, addressed to a woman who was no longer there to read it, and then he folded it once and put it back in his coat pocket. "I'll be back before Aldridge opens his office," he said. "If I come in from the east side of town on the back street—" "There's a door in the alley," Margaret said. "It's unlocked. Clara's key worked on it, which means the lock hasn't been changed." She looked at him directly. "Come in that way tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you find." He nodded once. He was already at the alley door when she spoke again. "Mr. Graves?" He stopped, but did not turn immediately. "Whatever happened 4 years ago, whatever you did or didn't do in that courtroom, you have been trying to make it right. You have been riding into this town every morning for months, leaving letters that nobody was supposed to know about for a woman who has now died for knowing about them." Her voice was steady. "That is not the behavior of a man whose word is worthless. That is the behavior of a man who has been trying to act without believing he has the right to." She paused. "I'm telling you that you have the right. Now use it." Elias Graves stood with his hand on the doorframe, and she could not see his face, and she did not need to. She had said what needed to be said, and she was not in the habit of repeating herself. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she confirmed. He left. She listened to his boots on the packed earth of the alley until she could not hear them anymore. Then she turned back to the desk and the files and the organized evidence of a long, careful crime, and she sat down in Clara Hewitt's chair and opened the ledger to the next falsified entry, and she began to work. She did not allow herself to think about what Cutter was. She did not allow herself to think about warm coffee and a Tuesday morning, and the particular silence of a room where something had happened that a single official word was supposed to contain and explain and close. She thought about the garrison survey line, and the 11 degrees of difference, and the 2 years of a man paying for water that was already his, and she thought about Dorothy Finch's timber rights, and the 18 months of someone else's profit harvested from a widow's land, and she thought about 22 parcels that she had not yet examined, and the people living on them who did not know what had been done to what they had built. She thought about Elias Graves on a horse in the early morning, every morning riding into town with something written in careful handwriting, leaving it under a door, riding back out alone. Doing it for months. Doing it because he believed the information was right, even when he believed himself to be insufficient. Which was, Margaret thought, a particular kind of courage that did not look like courage from the outside, and possibly did not feel like it from the inside either. She thought about her father's first rule. When someone tells you everything is in order, start looking for what isn't. And she thought about her father's second rule, the one he had only told her once at the end when the debts were already beyond managing, and the house was already half gone, and everything he had built was dissolving around them both. He had said the most dangerous thing you can do in a corrupt system is to be right and documented and willing to stand in a room and say so out loud. And the most important thing you can do after that is find one other person willing to stand in that room with you. She had been looking for that person for 28 years. She thought carefully, and without letting herself be certain about it yet, that Elias Graves might be him. Commissioner Aldridge appeared at her door at 10 o'clock precisely with a second cup of coffee he had brought from the hotel, and a question about the Mercer timber lease that was exactly the kind of test she had predicted it would be. The Mercer file had been altered 18 months ago. The official record showed an expiration date that gave Aldridge's company continued harvesting rights. The original agreement, which Margaret had already located in the pre-alteration correspondence file, showed an expiration date 14 months earlier. Aldridge set the coffee on her desk and smiled his careful smile and said, "I need a verification letter confirming the active status of the Mercer timber lease for a buyer inquiry. Standard procedure. Just a signature line confirming the county record as filed." Margaret looked at the Mercer file she had already pulled. She looked at the date on the record as filed. She looked at Aldridge. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I'll have it ready by end of day. I just want to make sure I have all supporting documentation in order first. You know how I am about being thorough." Aldridge's smile did not change. "Absolutely. No rush." He left the coffee. He left the office. Margaret watched the door close and then looked at the coffee and did not drink it, not because she believed it was dangerous, but because she found she had no appetite for anything given to her by that man. She pulled the Mercer correspondence file and began copying the original agreement dates in her own handwriting into the secondary record she had started keeping the previous night. A parallel record. One that lived not in this office, but in the locked interior pocket of her traveling bag, which lived not in this office, but in the apartment upstairs, which had a door with a bolt that she had checked twice before sleeping. She was thorough. She was documented. She was willing to stand in a room and say it out loud. She needed one more day. She needed Elias Graves to come back from Helena with what she had asked for. And she needed in the meantime for Vernon Aldridge to continue believing that the woman sitting in Clara Hewitt's chair was manageable. She looked at the closed door. She looked at the files. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Elias Graves came back the following morning with mud on his boots and a saddlebag that he set on the desk between them without a word and opened with hands that were steadier than Margaret expected, given what his face looked like. He had not slept. She could see that clearly. He had the particular quality of someone who had ridden through the night, not because they had to, but because stopping would have meant sitting alone with whatever they had found, and whatever he had found in Helena was not something he had wanted to sit alone with. "The original garrison survey," he said, setting a document on the desk. Dated 1871, stamped by the Territorial Surveyor's Office, unaltered. He set another beside it. "The Finch parcel. Original boundaries as filed at statehood. 61 acres, not 42. Full creek access and timber rights on the northeast quadrant." Another document. "The Mercer lease. Original expiration date is April 1881, 14 months ago." His hand paused above the saddlebag. "There are 11 more like these. Every parcel on your list." Margaret looked at the documents laid out across the desk. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. "He was not careful enough," she said finally. "He was careful enough for everyone he expected to be looking," Elias said. "He was not careful enough for someone who knew what the originals were supposed to say." Clara knew. Clara knew. He sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk. "The archivist in Helena. His name is Patterson Harold. Patterson, I've known him for 6 years. He told me something. He said that 2 months ago, a man came in requesting copies of several original survey documents. Said he was doing a routine county audit. Patterson pulled the files. The man looked at them, made some notes, thanked him, and left without requesting formal copies. Margaret looked up from the documents. Cutter? Patterson described him. Average height, brown coat, a scar along his left jaw. That matches what I know about him. Aldridge sent him to find out whether the Helena archive could contradict the altered county records, Margaret said. And when Patterson told him the originals existed, Aldridge knew it was only a matter of time before someone put the two versions side by side. She set down the document she was holding. Which means Aldridge knows the archive is a vulnerability. Which means he is either planning to address that vulnerability, or he has already decided that the county records are not where his exposure lies. If he destroys the county records, he can't destroy all of them without it being visible, Margaret said. But he doesn't need to destroy all of them. He only needs to destroy the ones that can be directly compared to the Helena originals. The survey correspondence, the notary certifications, the original deed filings. She looked at Elias directly. How long would it take you to identify which specific documents need to be preserved before he moves against them? I know which files, Elias said. I've been cataloging this for over a year. I can give you a list in 20 minutes. Then give me the list, Margaret said. Because I need to move the most critical documents out of this office today. Elias stared at her. If Aldridge finds out you've removed official county records, I'm not removing them, Margaret said. I'm making certified copies for the District Court Archive in Billings, which is entirely within my authority as county clerk, and which I will document precisely and correctly in the official records log, so that every action I take is visible and above reproach. She held his gaze. I am not going to give him anything he can use against me procedurally. Not one step outside my authority. Not one document that can be characterized as stolen or mishandled. Everything I do will be legal documented and defensible in front of any judge in this territory. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father taught you well. It landed differently than she expected. She had not told him about her father. She kept her expression neutral. Dorothy Finch is thorough, she said. She is. He almost smiled again. That ghost of a thing. She also told me you sat with her for 2 hours yesterday afternoon, going through her original deed copy, and that you found 3 additional alterations she hadn't known to look for. 4, Margaret said. There were 4. The third one was subtle enough that I almost missed it. The section and township numbers had been transposed, which by itself looks like a clerical error. But in combination with the boundary description change, it effectively removes her legal claim to the northwest pasture. She paused. Dorothy Finch has been grazing her late husband's cattle on land that the county record currently says belongs to someone else. If Aldridge decides to press that point, she loses the cattle too. The silence that followed was the kind that came from the space between understanding something intellectually and feeling the full weight of it in the body. We need to file the court complaint before he moves against any of the affected parcels, Elias said. Once a legal challenge is active, any action Aldridge takes against those properties during the proceedings becomes evidence of interference. It changes his calculus. I know, Margaret said. I need 3 more days. 2 to complete the certified copies and get them to the Billings archive by courier. 1 to draft the complaint with enough specificity that it cannot be dismissed on procedural grounds. She looked at him. And I need the homesteaders. I need Thomas Garrison and Dorothy Finch willing to put their names on a formal affidavit about their original deeds. I can have both of them in this office tomorrow evening, Elias said. After dark. The back door. After dark, Margaret agreed. He stood to go. He did the thing he had done, the first morning, reached for his coat, paused with his hand on it. The same hesitation in the same place. She was beginning to understand it as the moment when he decided whether to say the thing he was actually thinking or the thing that was safer to say. This time, he said the actual thing. Aldridge is going to come at you soon, he said. Not with questions about files. He gave you the Mercer verification request as a test, and you responded in a way that was compliant enough not to alarm him, but careful enough not to commit you. He is not a stupid man. He will read that correctly within a day or two. He looked at her steadily. When he decides you are a problem, he will send Cutter first, not to threaten you directly. Cutter doesn't work that way. He'll do something to the office or to your apartment, something designed to look like an accident or a misfortune. Something that puts you off balance without giving you anything concrete to report. Like a cardiac arrest? Margaret said. Like a cardiac arrest. His voice was flat and certain, and she appreciated the flatness of it. She had no use for softening right now. I want you to move your parallel records out of your apartment tonight. Not to my ranch, that's too far. Dorothy Finch's back room. She has a floor compartment under the cutting table that she's used to hide things before. Tell her I sent you. You've done this before, Margaret said. Hidden evidence at Dorothy's. Some of Clara's documentation, he said. The things she felt were most exposed. She moved them to Dorothy's 4 weeks before she died. He paused. They're still there. Dorothy has been waiting for someone to come for them. Margaret stood very still for a moment. Clara had more documentation than the letters, she said. Clara had a great deal more, Elias said. She had been building a parallel record for 6 months, systematic, careful. Something moved through his expression and steadied itself. She was braver than I gave her credit for, braver than I was for a long time. Margaret looked at him across the desk, across the documents that Clara Hewitt had worked toward and died before she could use, and that Margaret was now going to use in her name and in her memory and in the names of 22 homesteaders who had built something from nothing on land that a man in a wool coat had decided to take from them with ink and a cooperative notary. Tonight, she said. After the office closes, I'll go to Dorothy. He nodded. He put on his coat. He was at the alley door when she said his name. Elias. It was the first time she had used his given name. She had not planned it. It came out the way things came out when you were operating on very little sleep, and a great deal of focused fear, and the walls between the formal and the real became thinner than was advisable. He turned. What you told me yesterday. About Harmon. About what you did and didn't do. She held his gaze. Is there anyone else in this territory who knows that testimony as well as you do, who could reconstruct in specific legal terms what the evidence was and how it was discredited, and who benefited from that discrediting? He was still for a moment. There was a court reporter, a woman named Susanna Reeves. She transcribed the entire proceeding. She sent me a copy of the full transcript 3 years ago without explanation or return address. He paused. I still have it. Bring it, Margaret said. Why? Because I think what happened to Robert Aldine in that courtroom 4 years ago and what is happening to 22 homesteaders in this county right now were not separate crimes, she said. I think they were conducted by the same network of people using the same methods. And if I can demonstrate that to a judge in Billings, we are not filing a county land fraud complaint. We are filing a territorial conspiracy case, which is a different order of magnitude entirely. The expression on Elias Graves' face in that moment was complicated in a way that Margaret did not have language for yet. It was the look of a man who had been carrying a weight so long he had forgotten he was carrying it, and someone had just asked him to set it down in a way that might actually mean something. I'll bring the transcript, he said. He left. Margaret sat back down and looked at the documents on the desk and breathed in and out 3 times carefully, the way her father had taught her to do when a case opened up into something larger than she had initially understood, and the larger thing was both more powerful and more dangerous than the original shape. Commissioner Aldridge came to her office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He did not bring coffee this time. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his careful smile, and he said, Miss Calloway, I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment of your time on the matter of the Mercer verification letter. Of course, Margaret said. I've been reviewing the supporting file. Please sit down. He sat. He was the kind of man who sat with his back straight and his shoulders back, a man who had never had reason to make himself smaller in a room and did not intend to start now. Margaret recognized the posture because she had spent a great deal of her life in rooms with men who sat exactly that way, and she had learned that the posture was designed to make you feel that the room was already his before you said anything. She had also learned not to let it work. The Mercer file is interesting, she said pleasantly. I found some correspondence in the pre-1882 documentation that I want to make sure I understand correctly before I issue any certifications. Standard practice when I'm new to a record system. She smiled at him with the same quality of smile he gave her. Careful, present, saying something underneath it that was not what it said on the surface. I'm sure you understand. Absolutely, Aldridge said. What kind of correspondence? Survey correspondence primarily. Some discrepancies in how the parcel boundaries are described across different documents. Probably clerical inconsistencies from the transition period. I just want to make sure I have a complete picture before I put my name on anything. She tilted her head slightly. You know how I am about being thorough. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. Of course, he said. Take whatever time you need. I appreciate that, Margaret said. I expect I'll have it resolved by end of week. He stood. He put his hat back on. He was at the door when he said without turning, You know, Clara had a similar instinct when she first came to the position. Very detail-oriented, very thorough. He paused. She found the work quite demanding ultimately. The isolation of the position. Being a woman alone in this kind of environment. Another pause. I hope it suits you better. Margaret looked at the back of his wool coat. I've always found work most demanding when it's done incorrectly, she said. When it's done correctly, I find it clarifying. He left without responding. Margaret sat very still for a full minute after the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she stood up and walked to the cabinet where the Mercer survey correspondence was filed, and she pulled every document in that series and carried them to the copying desk, and began working at a pace that had nothing careful or measured about it, because Aldridge had just told her, with that pause and that coat and that remark about Clara, that her window was not 3 days. It was less than that. It might be 1. Dorothy Finch opened the back door of the seamstress shop before Margaret finished knocking. He came to see you today, Dorothy said. It was not a question. At 2 o'clock, Margaret said. He mentioned Clara. Dorothy's jaw tightened. She stepped back from the door. Come in. The back room of the seamstress shop was narrow and warm and smelled like cut fabric and the kind of industry that had been going on in a space for so long it had soaked into the walls. Dorothy moved to the cutting table, lifted it with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times, and pulled up the floor panel beneath it. In the space below was a wooden box. Not large, not small. The kind of box that had been chosen for what it could hold rather than for how it looked. Clara brought the last of it 3 days before she died, Dorothy said. She was frightened. She tried not to show it, but I've known frightened women long enough to recognize it through the performance. She set the box on the cutting table and looked at Margaret. She said someone would come for it eventually, that if she had done her job correctly, there would be enough here for whoever came next to finish what she started. Margaret opened the box, opened the Clara Hewitt had done her job correctly. Inside was a documentation that was methodical beyond anything Margaret had anticipated. Survey comparisons hand-drawn precise with both versions of each boundary marked in different ink so the differences were immediately visible. Notary certification records with dates and signature comparisons. A timeline written in Clara's small, careful script of every parcel alteration she had identified with the approximate date the alteration had been made based on the ink age and paper handling. And at the bottom, a single folded sheet with a list of names. Not homesteaders' names. Names Margaret recognized from Elias's letters, and from the county commissioner records, and from the political correspondence that moved through the official filing system, like water through a system of pipes, you only noticed when something stopped flowing. She knew who was connected to the Chicago company, Margaret said. She knew everything, Dorothy said quietly. She just didn't know how to make it matter. Margaret folded the list and put it in her interior pocket alongside her parallel records and the Helena copies and the 43rd letter that she had transferred to her own keeping 2 days ago. The one that ended with the words, "Someone will find them eventually, someone always does." "I know how to make it matter," Margaret said. Dorothy looked at her with the same expression she had worn the first day, the one that was the memory of hope rather than hope itself. And then very slowly, carefully, it became the actual thing. "What do you need from me?" Dorothy said. "Tomorrow night," Margaret said. "You and Thomas Garrison. Elias will bring him. Back door of the land office after the last lamp goes out on the main street." She met Dorothy's eyes. "I need your signatures on formal affidavits, legal documents that will go to the district court in Billings under my certification as county clerk. Once they are filed, Aldridge cannot move against your land without it being obstruction of an active court proceeding. And if he moves before we can file, then we document that too," Margaret said. "Every action he takes from this moment is either evidence of his guilt or evidence of his fear, and in a court of law, both of those things work in our favor." Dorothy Finch stood in her back room with her hands resting on the cutting table above the hidden box that had held Clara Hewitt's last careful work, and she looked at Margaret Calloway with the directness of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and was now deciding that patience had finally found a place to go. "I'll be there," she said, "and I'll bring Thomas Garrison myself. He's been wanting to put his name on something that means something for 2 years. She paused. "Miss Calloway, what Elias told me about you, about the way you read those files, the way you found what Clara found, and then found more." She stopped. "Clara was thorough," she said finally. "But I think you are something else." "Clara was thorough, and she was brave, and she built something that would have been impossible without her," Margaret said. "I am standing on what she built. That's all." Dorothy nodded once. The kind of nod that was also a decision. Margaret walked back to the land office, through the side street, with the wooden box under her coat, and the list of names in her pocket, and the particular cold certainty in her chest, of someone who has passed the point of choosing whether to act, and arrived at the simpler and more clarifying question of how. She had the documents. She had the witnesses. She had in a saddlebag on a ranch 6 miles northeast a court transcript that might expand a county land case into something the territorial attorney's office could not ignore without exposing itself. She also had she calculated as she slipped through the alley door and bolted it behind her somewhere between 18 and 36 hours before Vernon Aldridge decided that the new clerk's thoroughness was not an inconvenience to be managed, but a threat to be removed. She sat down at the desk and pulled the affidavit forms from the bottom of the supply cabinet and uncapped her pen and began to draft in the careful legal language her father had taught her, the document that was going to ask 2 ordinary people to put their names on the most dangerous piece of paper in Haskell County. She wrote through the night. She did not stop. Thomas Garrison was a large man with weathered hands and the particular stillness of someone who had been holding anger in his body for so long it had become indistinguishable from his posture. He sat in the chair across from Margaret's desk at 9:30 in the evening with Dorothy Finch beside him and Elias standing near the alley door, and he looked at the affidavit Margaret had drafted with the expression of a man reading something in a foreign language that he understood perfectly and wished he did not. "This says they changed my deed," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "While it was filed, while it was in the county record, someone went into the official record and changed what my deed said. Yes." He set the document down on the desk with a care that was the careful version of something that wanted to be violent. "I have been paying that man for water rights on my own creek for 2 years, he said. "My own creek. My father helped dig that channel in 1873. I was 11 years old. I carried rocks for 3 weeks. He looked up at Margaret. "I have been paying a man for access to something I built with my own hands as a child." "I know," Margaret said. "And Clara Hewitt knew." Clara Hewitt knew, and she was building a case, and she died before she could complete it. Margaret kept her voice steady and direct, because she had found in the last 2 days that Thomas Garrison responded to directness the way a good horse responded to a firm and honest hand, not with resistance, but with the kind of focused attention that was the precondition of trust. What she built is what brought us to this room tonight, and what we do in this room tonight is what determines whether her work meant something. Garrison looked at the affidavit for another long moment. Then he picked up Margaret's pen without asking and signed his name at the bottom in large, certain letters. Dorothy Finch signed beneath him without hesitation. Margaret notarized both signatures with the county seal she was legally authorized to use, documented the notarization in the official records log with the date and time and purpose written out in full, and then made 3 certified copies of each affidavit, one for the Billings District Court, one for the Territorial Attorney's Office, and one that went directly into Dorothy Finch's floor compartment before the night was over. "The courier leaves for Billings at 6 in the morning," Elias said. "If the documents are on that stage, they will be in the district court clerk's hands by tomorrow evening." "They'll be on the stage," Margaret said. "Aldridge has a contact at the stage office," Dorothy said. "He knows most of what goes in and out. He will know that I sent a certified records package to the Billings court," Margaret said. "That is an entirely routine action for a county clerk to take. He will not know what is in it until it arrives, and by the time it arrives and he can make any inquiries, it will already be entered into the court's intake record." She looked at each of them in turn. That is the moment his options change. Once it is in the court record, any action he takes against any of the affected parcels against any of us against the land office or its contents becomes legally actionable interference with an active court proceeding. "How long until the court acts on it?" Garrison asked. "The complaint will be assigned to Judge Ambrose Whitfield, who took the circuit appointment out of Billings last spring," Elias said. He said it with the careful quality of a man who had researched something thoroughly and was choosing his words accordingly. "I know his record. He is not connected to Aldridge's political network. He is, however, deliberate. He will not move fast." "How long?" Garrison repeated. 2 weeks, possibly 3, before he issues a preliminary hearing notice," Margaret said. "In the meantime, the complaint's existence is the protection, not the ruling, the filing." Garrison absorbed this. 2 weeks is a long time," he said. "A lot can happen in 2 weeks." "Yes," Margaret said. "It can." The silence that followed was honest in a way that she appreciated. She had not told them it would be without risk. She had not told them the filing made them safe. She had told them the truth, which was that the filing changed the nature of the risk from invisible to documented, and that documented risk was the only kind you could fight. After Garrison and Dorothy left through the alley door, Elias stayed. He did not sit down. He stood near the window with his arms crossed and his weight shifted slightly to his left. The stance of someone whose body had learned to be ready for things before his mind caught up to needing to be. Margaret had noticed him stand this way before. She was learning his physical vocabulary, the way she had learned her father's gradually, and mostly without intending to. "The transcript," she said. He reached into his coat and set it on the desk. It was thick, bound in the plain board covers of official court documentation, and the edges were worn in a way that suggested it had been handled many times and then put away and then handled again. "You've read it recently," she said. "Last night," he said, "after I left here." He looked at the transcript on the desk, but did not look at her. "I read it every year or so, to make sure I remember correctly, to make sure I haven't revised it in my own mind into something easier to live with." "And have you revised it?" "No." His voice was flat. "It is exactly as bad as I remember. The evidence I presented was correct and sufficient. What I failed to do was anticipate that the judge would allow the prosecution to introduce a prior unrelated matter to impeach the primary witness, which was a procedural irregularity I should have objected to, and did not, because I did not expect it and was not fast enough in that moment to counter it. He paused. A man died because I was not fast enough in one moment. And you have spent 4 years being fast enough in every subsequent moment to compensate for it, Margaret said. The letters, the archive research, the documentation. She looked at him directly. You have been building this case for 4 years, Elias. You built it alone and in secret because you didn't believe you had the standing to bring it yourself. But you built it. And everything we have in this room tonight exists because you built it. He looked at her then. That open, unfinished expression that she was beginning to understand was not uncertainty, but honesty, the face of a man who had stopped performing composure and had not yet decided what to do with what was underneath it. The Harmon case is connected, he said. I found the thread last night going back through the transcript. The land parcel at the center of that case, the one that Aldean was accused of fraudulently claiming it's on your list. Parcel 14, currently held by the Aldridge Land Company. They acquired it at auction after Aldean's conviction made his homestead claim void. Margaret was very still. Aldean was framed, she said. Aldean was framed, Elias said. The charge against him was forged document fraud. He was accused of filing a false homestead claim. The irony of that... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw tightened and released. The real fraud was the one used to frame him, and I had evidence that his claim was legitimate, and I did not fight hard enough for it, and a man died in prison for a crime that was committed against him, not by him, and the men who committed it walked away, and have been doing the same thing to 22 other families ever since. The weight of that sat between them in the lamplight of the land office, where Clara Hewitt had died, and where Margaret Calloway had spent 4 days building toward this moment, and neither of them tried to make it lighter than it was. This changes what we're filing, Margaret said finally. I know. This is not a county land fraud complaint anymore. This is a wrongful conviction case attached to a territorial conspiracy. She looked at the transcript and then at the list of names from Clara's box, and then at Elias. This requires the Territorial Attorney's Office, not just the District Court. The Territorial Attorney's Office in Helena has historically been resistant to cases that implicate the Land Commissioner Network, Elias said, which is why I have been reluctant to go that route. The Territorial Attorney's Office, as it was constituted 18 months ago, was resistant, Margaret said. The appointment rotated in March. The current Territorial Attorney is a man named Beaumont Hadley, who made his reputation in Butte prosecuting mining company fraud. She paused. He has been publicly critical of the Helena political establishment. He has also been publicly seeking a case significant enough to establish his office as independent of that establishment. She looked at Elias steadily. We are about to hand him the most significant case of his career. Elias stared at her. You researched the Territorial Attorney. On the train, she said. I do a great deal of reading. Something moved through his expression that was no longer the ghost of a smile. It was the actual thing, brief and real and quickly contained, but there unmistakably, and Margaret felt it land in a way she had not prepared for and chose not to examine too closely because they did not have time for it tonight. 2 separate filings, she said, returning to the documents. The district court complaint in Billings covering the land fraud. Simultaneously a formal referral to the Territorial Attorney's Office in Helena covering the wrongful conviction and the conspiracy evidence. She looked up. The simultaneous filing is important. If we stagger them, Aldridge has a window between the first filing and the second to apply pressure. If both land at the same time in different offices, he has to respond on 2 fronts at once, with 2 different political networks. He'll know it was us, Elias said. The moment those filings hit, he will know exactly what happened and who is responsible. Yes, Margaret said. He will. And Cutter. Cutter is the reason the filings have to happen tomorrow, Margaret said. Not in 2 days. Tomorrow morning. The billing stage at 6. A separate courier to Helena on the noon departure. She held Elias's gaze. Can you ride to Helena tonight? Arrive before the territorial attorney's office opens and file the referral in person before any message from Redemption can reach anyone in that city. He looked at her for a moment. It's a 6-hour ride. I know. It's nearly 10 o'clock. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, if I leave now, I can be at the attorney's office when it opens at 8. He reached for his coat. Write me the referral letter. Use your full title and the county seal. Make it impossible to set aside on procedural grounds. It will take me 20 minutes, Margaret said. She was already pulling paper from the cabinet. He stood and watched her write with the focused, efficient quality that she brought to every action pen, moving quickly across the page, language precise and formal and devastating in its specificity. And she was aware of him watching her and did not look up because looking up would cost her attention she did not have to spare. Margaret, he said. She looked up then because he had used her given name for the first time, and the way he said it made it impossible not to look up. When this is over, he said. When the filings are in, and Whitfield has issued his notice, and Hadley has opened his investigation, and Aldridge is no longer in a position to do what he did to Clara. He stopped, looked at something above her head for a moment, then back at her. I would like to have a conversation that is not about land records or court filings or the most efficient way to dismantle a criminal conspiracy. Margaret looked at him. What kind of conversation? She asked. The other kind, he said. The kind where I ask you how you learned to read a survey line the way most people read plain language, and you tell me about your father and I tell you about the ranch and the horses and why I bought 6 miles northeast of a town I had no intention of being part of. He paused. The kind where I ask whether you intend to stay in Redemption after this is resolved, or whether you'll go back to Cincinnati, and where I find out how you'd answer that. Margaret set down her pen. She looked at Elias Graves, this man who had ridden into this town alone every morning for months, leaving words for someone who could no longer read them, who had spent 4 years carrying a weight he had not put down until she told him he had the right to use it for something who was standing in this office at 10 o'clock at night, about to get on a horse and ride 6 hours through the dark because she had asked him to, and he had decided she was worth the ride. I'll be here when you get back, she said. He nodded once, and she thought that for a man who had been saying everything in letters for 4 years, he understood very well what those 6 words meant. She finished the referral letter. She sealed it with the county seal and signed it with her full title and handed it to him, and he put it inside his coat with the same care he took with everything that mattered. The back door, she said. The back door, he confirmed. He left. She listened to him go the way she had listened every morning, boots on packed earth, and then silence, and then the distant sound of a horse moving northeast into the dark. She turned back to the desk. She assembled the billings package with the methodical precision of someone building something that needed to hold under any pressure applied to it. The affidavits, the certified survey comparisons, the notary certification records, the Helena originals and their county record counterparts side by side, the differences marked in red ink so clearly that anyone looking at them would understand immediately and completely what had been done. Clara's timeline. The list of names. She worked until 2 in the morning. When the package was complete, she sealed it with the court seal and wrote the district court address in her clearest hand and set it on the corner of the desk where she would see it first thing and carry it to the stage herself. Then she sat back and looked at the office around her. At Clara Hewitt's desk, and Clara Hewitt's files, and Clara Hewitt's careful, brave, thorough work that had been waiting in a locked drawer for someone to come and know what to do with it. She thought about Elias on the road to Helena. She thought about Thomas Garrison's large, certain signature, and Dorothy Finch's that came without hesitation. She thought about a man named Robert Aldine, who had died in prison for a crime committed against him, and about the parcel of land that had been taken from him, and about how the same hands that had taken it had gone on taking for 4 more years. Because no one with the right position and the right knowledge and the willingness to stand in a room and say it out loud had arrived in Redemption, Montana until now. She was 30 years away from 55, and she thought of herself as a woman who did not traffic in sentiment. But sitting in that office at 2 in the morning with the sealed package on the corner of the desk, she felt something that she recognized after a moment as grief for Clara Hewitt. Not the abstract kind, the specific kind. The kind that came from understanding exactly what someone had done and what it had cost them, and that they had done it anyway. "I found them," she said to the empty office, to the desk and the files and the chair. "You were right that someone would." Then she stood up, picked up the package, carried it upstairs to her apartment, where the bolt was thrown on the door, set it beside her bed, where she would feel it if anyone tried to take it in the night, and lay down without undressing. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and listened to Redemption breathe around her and thought about what the morning would bring, and whether 6 hours was enough time to get to Helena, and whether Aldridge would make his move before or after the stage left at 6. Somewhere around 3 in the morning she heard something. Not the building settling. Not the wind. A specific sound from below. Deliberate. Someone trying to be quiet in a way that was almost but not quite completely silent. Margaret sat up. She picked up the package from beside the bed with one hand. She picked up the small revolver her father had given her when she left Cincinnati with the other. She sat in the dark, and she listened, and she waited, and she thought about Clara Hewitt's warm coffee and the word cardiac, and what it cost a man to arrange for a word to appear in a document. The sound came again. Below the floorboards. Not the alley door. The front door. Someone with a key, or with the skill to manage a lock without one. Margaret stood up. She was her father's daughter. She did not wait in dark rooms for things to come to her. She moved to the top of the stairs and listened, and in the silence below she heard the particular quality of someone pausing on the other side of a space because they sensed they were not alone in it. "I'm a county official," she said clearly into the dark below. "I am awake, I am armed, and I have already sent documentation to 2 separate court offices this evening. Whatever you came here for is not here anymore." A pause. "Tell Mr. Aldridge I said good evening." Silence. Then the sound of retreating steps, careful and deliberate, moving back toward the front, and the soft close of a door that was trying not to be heard. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs with the package under her arm and the revolver in her hand, and she breathed in and out 3 times carefully, the way her father had taught her. Then she went back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed and counted the hours until 6 o'clock. The stage left at 6 o'clock with the Billings package on it, and Margaret stood on the boardwalk and watched it go with the particular feeling of someone who has released something into the world that cannot be called back and has made peace with that fact. She had not slept. Her eyes felt like sand, and her hands were steadier than they had any right to be, and she thought that fear at a certain level of sustained intensity stopped feeling like fear and became something closer to clarity. Everything unnecessary fell away. What remained was only what mattered, and what needed to be done next. What needed to be done next was to go back inside and open the land office at its regular hour, and sit at Clara Hewitt's desk and do the work of a county clerk in the normal visible way, because the most dangerous thing she could do right now was give Vernon Aldridge any indication that last night had changed anything. She was at her desk with the ledger open and her pen uncapped when he came at 9 o'clock. He did not knock. He opened the door, the way men open doors, when they had decided the room was already theirs, and he stood in the frame for a moment, looking at her with the careful smile that had stopped reaching his eyes sometime in the last 12 hours, and Margaret looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had gotten a reasonable night's sleep and had no idea what he was referring to. "Good morning, Commissioner," she said. "Miss Calloway." He came to the desk. He did not sit. "I understand you sent a package on the morning stage." I send packages to the Billings Court Archive on a regular basis, Margaret said. Certified records copies. It's standard practice for county record maintenance. My predecessor did the same, I believe. Clara sent records packages to Billings once a quarter, Aldridge said. You've been in this position for 5 days. I found some documentation that needed to be preserved promptly, Margaret said. Survey correspondence from the pre-1882 period. The paper quality is deteriorating, and the court archive has better preservation conditions than our storage here. She looked at him with the pleasant, untroubled expression of someone who has nothing to hide and knows it, and knows that he knows it, and knows that they both know that this conversation is about something that is not being said. I documented everything in the official log. You're welcome to review it. He looked at the log she pushed toward him. He did not look at it for long. A man like Aldridge did not need to read a document to understand what it contained or what it meant that it existed. You also sent a courier on the noon stage yesterday, he said, to Helena. The Territorial Attorney's Office, Margaret said. A referral matter, again well within the scope of my authority as county clerk. She folded her hands on the desk. Commissioner, is there something specific I can help you with this morning? I have a full day of filing ahead of me. The silence that followed was the most honest thing he had said to her since she arrived. I want you to understand something, Aldridge said, and for the first time, the careful smile was entirely gone, and what replaced it was not anger, but something quieter and more deliberate than anger, the expression of a man who had been building something for a long time and was deciding how much of it to show. This county has been functioning well for a long time. People have homes and livelihoods and stability because of systems that work, systems that took years to develop. When people come into those systems without understanding how they function, they can cause a great deal of damage without intending to. I intend to cause no damage to anything legitimate, Margaret said. Clara Hewitt thought she was helping people too, he said. The words landed exactly the way he intended them to land. Margaret felt them land, felt the cold, specific threat in them, and she kept her face exactly where it was, and her hands exactly where they were. And she said, Clara Hewitt was an excellent records clerk. I've been very impressed with the quality of her work. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment, long enough that it was meant to be uncomfortable, long enough that it was a different kind of message than the one carried by his words. Then he said, Good day, Miss Calloway, and walked out and left the door open behind him. Margaret waited until his footsteps were gone. Then she stood up, walked to the door, and closed it herself. Then she walked back to the desk and sat down and allowed herself 30 seconds of sitting very still, with her hands flat on the desk, the way her father had taught her. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work, because the most important thing she could do for the next 2 weeks was to still be sitting in this chair doing visible, legitimate work every single day, because her presence in this office was the proof that the system had not succeeded in removing her, and that proof needed to be renewed every morning. Elias came back at noon. He came through the alley door, and he looked like a man who had ridden through the night and was running on something that was not sleep, but was more durable than sleep. And he sat down in the chair across from her desk and said, It's filed. Margaret let out a breath she had been holding in some form since 10 o'clock the previous night. Hadley was in his office when I arrived, Elias said. I had 20 minutes with him. I gave him the referral letter and the transcript, and a summary of the conspiracy evidence and the connection to the Aldean case. He paused. He read the transcript summary while I was sitting there. He read it like a man who had been looking for exactly this kind of case and had not expected to find it delivered to his office at 8 in the morning by a former marshal who resigned 4 years ago. What did he say? Margaret asked. He said he would open a formal investigation within 48 hours. Elias looked at her steadily. He also said that in his opinion, based on the evidence summary, the Aldean conviction should never have been returned, and that if the conspiracy evidence holds up, the men responsible for engineering that conviction will be facing charges that go considerably beyond land fraud. Good, Margaret said quietly. He also asked me a question. Elias paused. He asked why I waited 4 years. The question sat in the air between them. Margaret did not look away from it, and she did not look away from him. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him I didn't believe my word was worth enough to matter," Elias said, "and that I had recently been corrected on that point." The way he said it, quiet and direct and without ornamentation, hit Margaret somewhere she had not been prepared for it to hit. She looked at the desk for a moment, then back at him. "Aldridge came this morning," she said. Elias went still. "What did he say?" "He mentioned Clara." She kept her voice even, by name, in a way that was designed to tell me that what happened to her could happen to me. "He also knew about both the billing stage and the Helena courier, which means he has contacts at both departure points, which means we should assume he has been reading the official log entries I've been making, which are accurate and legitimate and give him nothing actionable," Elias said. "Exactly. But he is not interested in actionable right now. He is interested in frightened." She met his eyes. "And someone came to the office last night, after midnight, through the front door. They were skilled enough that they almost didn't make a sound." Elias looked at her with an expression that went through several things quickly and arrived at something controlled and very focused. "Did they?" "I was awake," she said. "I spoke to them from the top of the stairs. They left." She paused. "I told them I was armed and that the documentation had already been sent, which was true." "Cutter," Elias said. "Almost certainly." He stood up from the chair. He was not moving toward anything yet, but his whole body had the quality of something that had made a decision and was waiting for the right direction to move in, and Margaret recognized it as the thing underneath the guilt and the careful quietness, the thing that had made him a marshal for 8 years before one terrible moment in a courtroom had convinced him it was no longer there. "I need to be here at night," he said. "Elias." "Not as an imposition," he said. "As a practical matter. The documentation is the protection legally, but protection on paper does not stop a man from coming through a door at midnight with a specific purpose." He looked at her directly. "I should have been here last night. I knew Aldridge would move, and I went to Helena because the filing mattered more than my discomfort about what it meant to be visible in this town again, and both of those things were the right decision. But someone should be in this building overnight." "The hotel has rooms," Margaret said. "I know." They looked at each other across the desk, and there was in that looking something that had been building for 5 days, in the gaps between court filings and locked drawers, and 44 letters, and a man who rode into town in the dark to leave warnings for a dead woman, and neither of them named it because they had agreed without words to wait until this was resolved. But it was there, and they both knew it was there, and the knowing of it was enough for right now. "The hotel has rooms," Margaret said again more quietly. "I'll take one tonight," Elias said. "And tomorrow night, and however many nights it takes." She nodded once. He sat back down, and they spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what Aldridge expected them not to be doing, which was continuing to work. The response from Judge Ambrose Whitfield in Billings came 8 days later by formal courier, arriving at the land office on a Tuesday morning with the court seal on the envelope and the particular heft of official correspondence that meant it was going to require something from whoever received it. Margaret opened it at her desk, with Elias standing beside her and Dorothy Finch and Thomas Garrison sitting in the chairs across from her because she had sent word the previous evening that she expected news today, and they had a right to be present when it arrived. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for November 14th, 3 weeks away. Both Aldridge and his associated land company were named as respondents. The motion for a temporary restraining order on all parcel transfers or enforcement actions in the affected properties had been granted pending the hearing. Thomas Garrison made a sound that was not quite a word. Dorothy Finch pressed both hands flat on her knees and closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was something in her face that had not been there before, something that had been absent for long enough that its return was visible as a physical change. The restraining order means he cannot move against your land, Margaret said. Not the creek access, not the timber rights, not the cattle on the northwest pasture. Any attempt to enforce any claim on any of the affected parcels while this order is active is contempt of court. He won't like that, Garrison said. No, Margaret agreed. He won't. What happens to him? Dorothy asked. After the hearing, if the judge rules in our favor. The land fraud finding triggers the referral to the territorial attorney, Margaret said, which is already open. Hadley's investigation is running parallel to the court proceeding. If the conspiracy evidence holds, and it will hold, because Clara built it to hold, the charges will extend beyond civil land fraud into criminal territory. She paused. Aldridge, his notary Cutter, and every member of the Chicago Land Company with documented involvement in the scheme will face criminal prosecution. The Aldean conviction will be formally vacated. She looked at Elias when she said that last part. He was looking at the restraining order in Margaret's hands, and his expression was the open, unfinished one she had come to recognize, except that something in it was resolving the way a wound resolved not into what it had been before, but into something different, that was permanent and livable and no longer raw. Robert Aldean, Dorothy said quietly. Robert Aldean, Margaret confirmed. His family will be notified. The parcel that was taken from him will be returned through the estate. The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that. Then Thomas Garrison leaned forward in his chair and said in the voice of a man who had been holding something for 2 years and was carefully setting it down. What do we do now? Now you go home, Margaret said. You tend your land and your cattle and your creek that is already yours under the law and has always been. And in 3 weeks you come to Billings and you say in a courtroom exactly what you told me in this office 10 days ago. She looked at him steadily. You tell them about the rocks you carried when you were 11 years old. You tell them about your father. You tell them what 2 years of paying for your own water felt like. She paused. The judge needs to understand what was taken from real people, not just what was changed in a document, what it meant to the people it was changed on. That is your testimony. That is what no one else in that courtroom can give. Garrison nodded. He looked like a man who had just remembered that he was capable of something he had forgotten. Dorothy stood and surprised Margaret entirely by taking her hands in both of hers and holding them for a moment without speaking. Her hands were strong and dry and warm, the hands of someone who had worked hard for a long time, and what she communicated through them was something that could not have been said as well in words, which was that she understood what this had cost and what it had required, and that she was not going to let it go unremarked, even if she could not fully name it. Clara would have liked you, Dorothy said finally. I would have liked her, Margaret said. After they left, the office was quiet in the particular way of a space where something significant had just occurred, and the air had not yet settled back to normal. Margaret set the restraining order carefully in the file she had built for this case, the parallel record that had started as her own protection and become the evidentiary spine of a territorial conspiracy prosecution. Elias was still standing near the window. He had been quiet through most of the last hour, in the way he was quiet when he was processing something that was too large to speak about immediately, and she had learned to give that silence the space it required. 4 years, he said. Elias? I need to say it, he said. Just once, and then I'm done with it. He turned from the window and looked at her. 4 years. Robert Aldean has been dead for 3 of them. His family has been without him. The land that was taken from him has been sitting in the hands of people who took it through fraud and a false conviction that I did not fight hard enough to prevent. He paused. And the same men who did that to him did it to 22 other families over the years that followed, because no one stopped them, because I did not stop them when I had the position and the authority to do so. You stopped them now, Margaret said. You stopped them, he said. I helped. You built the case that made it possible to stop them. You built it for 4 years alone in the dark, leaving letters under a door. That is not helping. That is the thing itself." She held his gaze. "Hadley would not have opened that investigation on my referral alone. He opened it on the transcript you carried to his office at 8 in the morning after riding through the night. Your testimony, your documentation, your 4 years of careful, invisible, determined work." She paused. "Take credit for what you did. It matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not sure I know how to do that." "I know," she said. "You'll learn." He almost smiled. The actual thing, again brief and real, and this time she did not look away from it quickly enough to avoid feeling it land. "The conversation," he said. "The one I mentioned. The other kind." "Yes," she said. "I believe you said you'd still be here when I got back from Helena." He tilted his head slightly. "I got back from Helena." "You did," Margaret said. "So." He moved away from the window and stood across the desk from her, and the formality of the desk between them was suddenly an absurd thing, a piece of furniture in a room where it did not belong, and they both seemed to feel this simultaneously, because he came around it, and she stood up, and there was no longer a desk between them at all, just the few feet of the land office of Redemption, Montana, which smelled like old paper, and something underneath the paper that Margaret had understood completely by her 3rd day, and had stopped minding sometime after that. "How did you learn to read a survey line?" he said, "the way most people read plain language?" "My father," she said. "He used to give me deed documents and ask me to find the lie in them. He said a corrupt deed was like a poorly told story. The language gave itself away if you knew what fluent language sounded like." She paused. He was right. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was, she said. For a long time. And then he wasn't for a while. And then he was again at the very end, which is what I choose to remember. She looked at Elias. "Now you. The ranch. Why 6 miles northeast of a town you had no intention of being part of?" "Because I needed to be close enough to watch," he said. "Without being seen watching. 6 miles was the distance at which I could ride in before dawn and leave before anyone was properly awake." He paused. "I told myself it was about the case, about Aldridge and the documentation and finding the right person to bring it to." He looked at her steadily. "I'm no longer entirely sure that was the only reason." Margaret looked at him. At the man who had spent 4 years riding toward a town he couldn't bring himself to belong to, leaving words for people who needed them carrying a weight that he had decided he did not have the right to put down until someone told him otherwise. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "In Redemption, after the hearing?" "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether there's a reason to. The simplicity of it. The directness of it. The same quality she had found in his letters, the way he communicated through the gap between what was said and what was meant. Only this time, the gap had closed entirely, and what was left was just the plain thing, unadorned and honest, and right there between them in the lamplight. "The hearing is in 3 weeks, Margaret said. 3 weeks, he agreed. "I will still be here in 3 weeks, she said. "I will still be here after the hearing. I will still be here when Hadley's indictments come down, and when the Aldean family receives notification, and when Thomas Garrison stops paying for his own creek, and when Dorothy Finch's timber rights are formally restored." She held his gaze. "I did not come to Redemption, Montana to pass through it. I came because the work was here, and the work turns out to be larger than I expected, and more important than I expected, and—" She paused. "The people in it are more than I expected." Elias Graves looked at her for a long moment with that open, resolved, finished expression. The wound that had healed into something permanent and livable. The face of a man who had made peace with his past, not by forgetting it, but by deciding to use it for something. "Then I'm staying," he said. Outside Redemption, Montana went on being a frontier town in October, cold and practical and indifferent to the small revolutions occurring in its land office. The stage ran its route. The general store opened and closed. Men moved through the street with the deliberate economy of people who knew the West did not reward haste. In 3 weeks, Judge Ambrose Whitfield would convene a preliminary hearing in Billings that would expand within 6 months into the largest land fraud prosecution in Montana territorial history. Vernon Aldridge would be arrested on the courthouse steps of his own county seat on a Tuesday morning in December, his wool coat offering him no more protection against the cold than it did against the charges enumerated in a 40-page indictment that bore, among other signatures, that of former U.S. Marshal Elias Graves. Cutter would testify against Aldridge in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony would confirm what Clara Hewitt's careful documentation had established, and what Margaret Calloway had built into a case that could not be buried or dismissed or quietly ruled a cardiac arrest. The Aldean family would receive a formal letter of vacatur from the territorial court on a January morning, too late to bring Robert Aldean home, but not too late to restore his name and return his land to his children, who would work it the following spring for the first time as its rightful owners. Dorothy Finch would stand in a Billings courtroom in November and tell a federal judge about the rocks that Thomas Garrison's father had carried to build a water channel in 1873, and about the timber on her northeast quadrant that had been feeding someone else's profit for 18 months, and about a woman named Clara Hewitt who had known the truth and protected it until someone could come who knew what to do with it. She would not cry while she testified. She would speak with the steady, measured certainty of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and was now spending that patience on something that deserved it. And Margaret Calloway would stand at the window of the Redemption Land Office on the morning after the restraining order arrived and look at the street of a town she had come to in fear with $41 and the contents of her father's case files locked in her memory. And she would understand something that she had been understanding in increments since the morning she called out to a man on a horse who had been riding alone toward a door where no one was waiting. That the most dangerous thing in a corrupt system was not a woman with nothing left to lose. It was a woman with nothing left to lose who had found in the most unexpected place, at the most unexpected time, one person willing to stand in the same room with her and say the same true thing out loud. She had come to redemption looking for justice. She had found it letter by careful letter choice by deliberate choice, in the accumulated weight of 2 people who had decided that the truth was worth the risk of being visible. That was enough. That had always been enough. And now, finally, it was also sufficient.